Marcus Chen had never seen a sunset, but he could tell you exactly what one sounded like. The gentle hush of evening traffic softening into whispers. The way voices carried differently when the air grew cooler. The subtle shift in footsteps as people hurried home, their pace quickening with the approaching darkness that meant nothing to him but everything to everyone else. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. At 26, Marcus had inherited more money than most people could spend in 10 lifetimes, but he'd trade every dollar to see his mother's face just once. The irony wasn't lost on him that he lived in a penthouse overlooking Central Park, surrounded by what everyone called breathtaking views, while he navigated his world through sound, touch, and the careful choreography of memorized steps. His father, William Chen, had built a tech empire from nothing, driven by the belief that determination could overcome any obstacle. But determination couldn't restore sight to optic nerves damaged before birth, and after 26 years, even William was beginning to understand that some problems couldn't be solved with money or willpower. The latest attempt sat across from Marcus in an upscale Manhattan restaurant, her voice pitched at that particular frequency reserved for speaking to children or pets. "The lobster here is just gorgeous," she gushed, apparently unaware that aesthetic descriptions of food did nothing for someone who experienced meals through taste and aroma alone. "It's such a beautiful coral color, like a sunset over the ocean." Marcus nodded politely, his fingers finding the stem of his water glass with practiced ease. This was date number 4 in what his father optimistically called his social expansion project. Each woman had been carefully selected from New York's most eligible circles: intelligent, accomplished, and according to his father's research, genuinely kind-hearted. What his father hadn't accounted for was how differently people behaved when they discovered the extent of the Chen family fortune, or how awkward they became around his blindness. "I've always been fascinated by marine biology," his date continued, though Marcus suspected this newfound interest had emerged sometime between the background check his father's team had undoubtedly run and this evening's conversation. "The way sea creatures adapt to their environment is just incredible. It's like they develop these amazing alternative senses." The comment hung in the air like a lead balloon. Marcus took a careful sip of his wine, buying himself a moment to formulate a response that wouldn't reveal his irritation. He'd heard variations of this conversation countless times, well-meaning people drawing parallels between his blindness and various animals' adaptations, as if his life were some fascinating nature documentary rather than simply his reality. "Adaptation is important," he agreed, setting his glass down with deliberate precision. "Though I find most people adapt to circumstances they think they understand, rather than circumstances that actually exist." She laughed, a tinkling sound that reminded him of wind chimes in a gentle breeze. "Pretty, but ultimately hollow. You're so philosophical. I love that about you." Marcus wondered what else she loved about him. His bank account, perhaps. The penthouse apartment she'd complimented extensively before they'd left for dinner. The private car service that had picked her up, complete with a driver who'd been instructed to treat her like royalty. He'd grown cynical about these encounters, though he tried not to let it show. Each woman approached him with a mixture of fascination and pity that made his skin crawl. They spoke to him slowly, as if blindness had affected his hearing or intelligence. They described everything in excruciating visual detail, apparently believing this would somehow enhance his experience, when in reality it only highlighted the vast gulf between their worlds. The worst part wasn't their awkwardness around his disability. He could forgive that. People were uncomfortable with what they didn't understand, and blindness remained foreign territory for most of the sighted world. What bothered him was their inability to see past the obvious. They looked at him and saw either a tragic figure to be pitied or a wealthy prize to be won, but they never seemed to see Marcus himself. His phone buzzed against his leg, the distinctive pattern that indicated a message from his father. Marcus ignored it, focusing instead on the sounds around him. The restaurant hummed with the typical dinner crowd. The clink of silverware against china, the soft murmur of conversation punctuated by occasional laughter, the whisper of servers moving between tables with practiced efficiency. "Are you expecting a call?" his date asked, though Marcus hadn't made any move toward his phone. "Just my father checking in," he said. "He worries." "That's sweet. You two must be close." They were, in their own complicated way. William Chen loved his son fiercely, But his love came wrapped in layers of guilt and overprotectiveness that sometimes felt more suffocating than supportive. Marcus understood his father's drive to fix things, to make his son's life as normal and comfortable as possible, but normal wasn't something that could be purchased or arranged. The evening continued its predictable course. His date ordered the most expensive item on the menu without looking at prices, made careful conversation about art galleries and charity events, and asked thoughtful questions that felt rehearsed rather than genuine. She was perfectly nice, Marcus realized, perfectly appropriate, perfectly wrong. By the time dessert arrived, he'd already decided this would be their last meeting. He'd thank her for a lovely evening, his driver would take her home, and tomorrow he'd have another awkward conversation with his father about realistic expectations and the difference between companionship and compatibility. "I had such a wonderful time tonight," she said as they waited for the check. "I hope we can do this again soon." "I enjoyed it too," Marcus lied smoothly, the social pleasantries rolling off his tongue like a well-rehearsed script. The lie sat bitter in his mouth as they left the restaurant. His driver, James, helped his date into the car with professional courtesy, then held the door for Marcus. The familiar routine of settling into the back seat, the soft hum of the engine, the gentle motion of the car navigating Manhattan traffic, all of it felt like an elaborate performance in which he'd somehow become both actor and unwilling audience. As they dropped his date at her Upper East Side apartment, Marcus wondered if this was simply his reality. Perhaps genuine connection was a luxury he couldn't afford, not because of his wealth, but because of everything that came with it. The assumptions, the expectations, the careful choreography of social interactions that left no room for spontaneity or authentic discovery. The car fell silent after his date's effusive goodbyes faded into the night. James knew better than to make small talk, unless Marcus initiated it, and tonight, Marcus felt wrapped in a cocoon of disappointment that he wasn't ready to break open with conversation. His phone buzzed again. This time he answered. "How did it go?" His father's voice carried that particular blend of hope and resignation that had become familiar over the past few months. "She was lovely," Marcus said, because it was true and because he didn't have the energy for a longer conversation about why lovely wasn't enough. "But?" Marcus smiled despite his mood. His father knew him too well to be fooled by diplomatic responses. "But I think we both knew by the appetizer that this wasn't going to work." William sighed on the other end of the line. "I don't understand it, son. These are good women. Intelligent, accomplished, kind-hearted. What are we missing?" What they were missing, Marcus thought, was the possibility that compatibility couldn't be engineered through careful selection and optimal circumstances. What they were missing was the understanding that he wanted to be surprised by someone, challenged by them, changed by them in ways that had nothing to do with his disability or his bank account. But these were thoughts too complex and too fragile to share over a phone call in the back of a moving car, so instead he said, "Maybe we should take a break from the formal introductions for a while." "If that's what you want," his father said, though Marcus could hear the disappointment in his voice. "Though I do have one more possibility. A friend of a friend, actually. A teacher, I think. Very down to earth." Marcus closed his eyes, feeling a familiar headache building behind his temples. "Dad, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but—" "Just think about it," William interrupted gently. "No pressure. But Marcus, I want you to be happy. I want you to have what your mother and I had." The mention of his mother softened Marcus's resistance. She died when he was 12, and his memories of her were built from touch and voice, and the particular way she'd smelled like jasmine and coffee in the mornings. She'd never treated his blindness as something to be overcome or compensated for. It was simply part of who he was, no more defining than his height or the color of his hair. "I'll think about it," he promised, because sometimes love requires small compromises. As the car pulled up to his building, Marcus felt the familiar mix of relief and loneliness that marked the end of another failed evening. Tomorrow would bring new routines, new challenges, and probably another conversation with his father about the mysterious fifth woman who was supposedly different from all the others. He just couldn't bring himself to believe that different necessarily meant better. 3 weeks later, Marcus found himself standing outside a small cafe in Brooklyn, questioning every decision that had led him to this moment. The address his father had given him was supposed to be for an upscale restaurant in Midtown, but James had confirmed twice that this was the correct location. The sounds filtering from inside were nothing like the hushed elegance of Manhattan's finest establishments. Instead, He heard the hiss of an espresso machine, the clatter of dishes, and the easy laughter of people who weren't performing for anyone. "Are you sure this is right?" Marcus asked James, though he already knew his driver had double-checked everything. "Yes, sir." "Rosie's Corner Cafe, 127 Atlantic Avenue. Shall I wait?" Marcus hesitated. Every instinct told him to get back in the car and call his father to sort out whatever mix-up had occurred. Preparing and narrating the story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The honest sounds of a place where people actually lived rather than just dined made him curious enough to stay. "Give me an hour," he decided. "If this is some kind of mistake, at least I'll have good coffee." The bell above the door chimed as Marcus entered, a sound so cheerful and welcoming that he almost smiled despite his confusion. The cafe smelled like cinnamon and fresh bread, with underlying notes of coffee beans and something sweet he couldn't quite identify. His cane tapped against worn wooden floors, and he could sense the space opening up around him. Not large, but comfortable, with the kind of lived-in atmosphere that spoke of regular customers and familiar routines. "Seat yourself anywhere you'd like, honey," called a voice from behind what he assumed was the counter. "I'll be right with you." Marcus made his way carefully toward what sounded like the quieter side of the cafe, his cane locating a small table near what he guessed was a window, based on the different quality of sound coming from that direction. He folded his cane and settled into a chair that wobbled slightly, so different from the perfectly calibrated furniture in the restaurants he usually frequented. "Sorry about that wait," came a voice beside him, closer now. "Friday afternoons get a little crazy around here. Can I start you off with something to drink?" Marcus looked up toward the voice and felt something shift in the air around him. He'd learned to read people through their voices, and this one was different from any he'd encountered during his recent dating experiences. There was no careful modulation, no studied politeness, just genuine warmth with a slight rasp that suggested someone who laughed often and wasn't afraid to speak her mind. "Coffee would be great," he said. "Black, if you have it." "Honey, if we didn't have black coffee, we'd have to close down and disappoint half of Brooklyn," she said with a laugh that was nothing like wind chimes. This was the sound of summer rain on a tin roof. Unexpected, natural, real. "Do you want the good stuff, or the stuff that'll wake the dead?" Marcus found himself smiling for the first time in weeks. "Surprise me." "I like a man who lives dangerously," she said, and he could hear the grin in her voice. "I'm Sophie, by the way. Sophie Martinez. I practically live here, so if you need anything at all, just holler." As her footsteps retreated toward the counter, Marcus tried to process what had just happened. Sophie had spoken to him like he was simply another customer, not a blind man requiring special accommodation or a wealthy target requiring careful handling. She hadn't described the cafe's decor or asked if he needed help reading a menu. She'd just been normal. The coffee arrived within minutes, and Marcus could smell its richness before Sophie set the cup down. "Rosie's special blend," she announced. "She roasts the beans herself in the back room. Fair warning, it's strong enough to power a small aircraft." Marcus lifted the cup and took a careful sip. The coffee was indeed strong, but with a complexity of flavors that spoke of beans selected and roasted by someone who understood their craft. "This is incredible," he said honestly. "Right? I've been trying to figure out Rosie's secret for 2 years now. She claims it's all about the timing, but I think she's got some kind of magic back there." Sophie's voice came from the chair across from him, and Marcus realized she'd sat down. "Do you mind if I take a quick break? My feet are killing me, and you look like you might actually have an interesting conversation with you." This was definitely not how his usual dates began. Marcus found himself intrigued by the casualness of it all, the way Sophie had simply decided they might enjoy talking, and acted on that instinct without any of the careful choreography he'd grown accustomed to. "I don't mind at all," he said, "though I should probably mention that I might not be who you're expecting." Sophie laughed again, that summer rain sound. "Honey, the only thing I was expecting was another long shift and sore feet. Everything else is a bonus. Why are you secretly a serial killer or something?" "Nothing that dramatic," Marcus said, surprised by how easy it was to talk to her. "I think there might have been some kind of mix-up. I was supposed to meet someone here, but I'm starting to think I'm in the wrong place entirely." "Well, you're definitely in the right place for coffee and conversation," Sophie said. And if whoever you're supposed to meet doesn't show up, their loss. So what do you do when you're not sitting in Brooklyn cafes having existential crises about your location? Marcus hesitated. This was usually the moment when conversations shifted, when people's voices changed as they recalculated his worth and adjusted their behavior accordingly. But something about Sophie's straightforward manner made him want to test the waters of honesty. "I'm between things right now," he said, which was technically true. "Trying to figure out what comes next." "Ah, a fellow life wanderer," Sophie said approvingly. "I respect that. Too many people act like they've got everything figured out when really they're just going through the motions." A crash from the kitchen interrupted their conversation, followed by creative cursing in what sounded like both English and Spanish. Sophie sighed. "And that would be Danny discovering that our dishwasher has officially given up the ghost." "Excuse me for just a second." As Sophie's footsteps retreated, Marcus found himself wanting her to come back quickly. There was something energizing about her presence, the way she moved through the world with apparent confidence and humor. She hadn't asked him about his blindness, hadn't offered unnecessary help or spoken to him with that careful gentleness he'd come to expect from strangers. The sounds from the kitchen grew more animated, and Marcus gathered that the dishwasher situation was more serious than Sophie had initially indicated. He could hear her voice rising above the chaos, not angry but clearly taking charge of whatever crisis had erupted. There was competence in her tone, the sound of someone accustomed to solving problems with limited resources and unlimited creativity. When she returned 10 minutes later, she sounded slightly breathless but not defeated. "Sorry about that. Crisis management is apparently part of my job description today." "Where were we?" "You were telling me about people going through the motions," Marcus prompted, genuinely interested in her perspective. "Right," Sophie settled back into her chair. "It's like everyone's so afraid of making the wrong choice that they end up making no choice at all. They take jobs they hate because they're safe, date people they're lukewarm about because they check boxes, live in places that drain their souls because it's what they're supposed to want." Marcus felt something stir in his chest, a recognition that was both uncomfortable and exhilarating. "And you don't do that?" "Oh, I definitely did that," Sophie said with self-deprecating honesty. "Spent 4 years in a cubicle doing data entry for an insurance company because it was steady work with good benefits. I nearly lost my mind. One day I realized I was more excited about my lunch break than anything else in my life, and I figured that was probably a sign." "So you became a waitress?" "I became a lot of things," Sophie corrected. "Waitress, amateur photographer, part-time art teacher for kids, occasional dog walker for Mrs. Henderson down the street who refuses to admit she needs help. I'm what you might call a professional life enthusiast." Marcus found himself leaning forward, drawn in by her energy. "That sounds exhausting." "Sometimes," Sophie admitted. "But it's the good kind of exhausting, you know, like when you've been dancing all night or laughing until your stomach hurts. It's exhausting because you're actually living, not because you're slowly dying of boredom." There was something about the way she described life that made Marcus acutely aware of how carefully controlled his own existence had become. When was the last time he'd felt exhausted from truly living rather than from managing the elaborate performance of his daily routine? "What about you?" Sophie asked, and Marcus realized he'd been quiet for too long. "What makes you feel alive?" The question caught him off guard. Not what he did for work, not where he went to school, not even the polite inquiries about his blindness that usually dominated first conversations. Just a simple, direct question about what brought him joy. "Music," he said without thinking. "Playing piano, actually. There's something about the way sounds can create colors that don't exist anywhere else." "Colors?" Sophie's voice carried genuine curiosity, not the careful tiptoeing he usually encountered when the subject touched on his visual experience. Marcus felt heat rise in his cheeks. "Sorry, that probably doesn't make much sense. I tend to think about sounds in terms of color, even though I've never actually seen." "No, that makes perfect sense," Sophie interrupted, and there was excitement in her voice now. "I do that with emotions. Like, happiness isn't just a feeling for me. It's golden, warm, with this fizzy quality around the edges. And sadness is always blue, but not pretty blue. More like the color of water when it's too deep to see the bottom." Marcus stared in her general direction, momentarily speechless. In all his years of trying to explain synesthetic experiences to sighted people, no one had ever responded with such immediate understanding. Most people nodded politely and changed the subject, or worse, asked him to explain how he could possibly understand color without sight, as if his entire sensory experience was somehow invalid. "Exactly," he said, and his voice came out rougher than he'd intended. "Music is like painting with sound. Different instruments have different colors, different textures. A violin is silver, thin but bright. Piano is usually golden, but it can shift depending on the key, the mood. Minor keys go darker, more like copper or bronze. What color is my voice?" Sophie asked, and there was something playful but also vulnerable in the question, as if she genuinely cared about his answer. Marcus listened to the silence for a moment, then to the way she breathed, the subtle timbre that made her voice uniquely hers. "Amber," he said finally. "Warm amber with flecks of gold when you laugh, and when you get excited about something, like just now, it brightens to almost yellow-orange, like candlelight." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was full, charged with something Marcus couldn't quite name. When Sophie finally spoke, her voice was softer than before. "No one's ever described my voice like that," she said. "That's beautiful." Marcus felt something shift between them, a recognition that this conversation had moved beyond Cass. Marcus stood outside Rosie's Corner Cafe at dawn, his heart hammering against his ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. The morning air carried the scent of rain-washed streets and fresh bread from the bakery next door. Familiar smells that somehow felt different today, charged with possibility and terror in equal measure. He'd been standing here for 20 minutes, gathering courage that seemed to slip through his fingers every time he reached for the door handle. James waited in the car behind him, under strict instructions not to intervene no matter how long this took. This conversation, if Sophie would even have it, needed to happen without escape routes or safety nets. The cafe wasn't open yet, but Marcus could hear movement inside, the familiar sounds of morning preparation that he'd grown to love during his weeks of secret visits. Sophie would be there, probably wrestling with the temperamental espresso machine or trying to coax the ancient cash register into cooperation. She always arrived first, claiming it was because she needed the quiet to organize her thoughts for the day ahead. Marcus raised his hand to knock, then let it fall. What if she refused to see him? What if the hurt in her voice during their last phone call had crystallized into something harder, more permanent? What if he'd destroyed the most real thing in his life for the sake of protecting feelings that no longer needed protection? The door opened before he could decide, and Sophie's voice cut through his spiraling thoughts like a lighthouse beam through fog. "Are you going to stand out there all morning, or are you planning to actually come in?" Marcus turned toward her voice, and despite everything, felt his mouth curve into a helpless smile. "I wasn't sure you'd want to see me." "I don't," Sophie said, but there was no real anger in it. "I want to throw things at you and yell about trust and honesty and how stupid rich people can be when they think money solves everything. But I also want to understand why you thought lying was better than giving me a chance to know who you really are." She stepped aside to let him enter, and Marcus crossed the threshold into the cafe that had become more of a home to him than his penthouse ever was. The familiar sense of coffee and cinnamon wrapped around him like an embrace, but underneath lay the tension of everything unsaid between them. "Sit," Sophie commanded, pointing him toward their usual table by the window. "I'm going to make coffee, and then you're going to explain everything. No more editing. No more protecting my delicate feelings from your terrible burden of wealth. All of it." Marcus settled into the wobbly chair that Sophie had never bothered to fix, despite his offers to replace it. She'd claimed it had character. That perfectly stable furniture was for people who'd forgotten how to adapt. Now he wondered if she'd been talking about more than furniture. The espresso machine hissed and gurgled while Sophie worked, and Marcus used the familiar sounds to center himself. Whatever happened in the next hour would determine whether he'd lost the best thing in his life or found a way to build something real from the ruins of his deception. "Here." Sophie set a cup in front of him, the ceramic warm against his palms. "Rosie's special blend, extra strong. You're going to need it." She sat across from him, and Marcus could feel her gaze like a physical weight. He'd grown accustomed to the careful way most people looked at him, with pity, curiosity, or the studied politeness of those determined not to stare. But Sophie had always looked at him directly, fully, as if his blindness was simply another characteristic, like the color of his hair or the way he gestured when he talked. I was born into money, Marcus began, then stopped. No, that's not right. I was born into obligation. My father built his company because he wanted to give me everything he never had. Security, opportunity, choice. But the money came with conditions I didn't understand until I was older. Sophie remained silent, letting him find his way through the explanation. People treat you differently when they know, Marcus continued. Not just differently. They become different people entirely. They edit their personalities, their responses, their honest reactions to fit what they think you want to hear. I've had friends disappear when my trust fund made the news, and I've had strangers become instant best friends for the same reason. So you decided to lie to me, Sophie said, her voice carefully neutral. I decided to be someone I thought you could actually care about, Marcus corrected. Marcus, the graduate student struggling to find his place in the world. Marcus who understood what it meant to work for everything you have. Marcus who wasn't carrying the weight of other people's expectations and assumptions. Except that's not who you are. Marcus set down his coffee cup with shaking hands. Isn't it? Everything I told you about feeling lost, about wanting something real, that was true. The music, the way I experienced the world, the loneliness, all of that was true. The only lie was the context. The context matters, Marcus. Sophie's voice carried a pain that cut deeper than anger would have. You let me tell you about my struggles with money, about choosing between paying rent and buying groceries, about working 3 jobs just to survive. You let me feel sorry for your fake financial struggles while you were living in a penthouse. I know. The words came out barely above a whisper. I know how that must have felt, and I'm sorry. I'm more sorry than I know how to express. Are you sorry you lied, or sorry you got caught? The question hung between them like a blade, sharp and unforgiving. Marcus forced himself to consider it honestly, to examine his motivations without the comfortable cushion of self-justification. Both, he finally admitted. I'm sorry I got caught because it means I hurt you, and hurting you is the last thing I ever wanted to do. But I'm also sorry I lied because it means I never gave you the chance to choose me knowing who I really am. Sophie's silence stretched long enough that Marcus began to wonder if she'd left the table entirely. When she finally spoke, her voice was smaller than he'd ever heard it. Do you have any idea what it's like to discover that someone you care about has been studying you like a science experiment? Watching your reactions, cataloging your responses, measuring your authenticity against some invisible standard? Marcus felt the blood drain from his face. It wasn't like that. Wasn't it? You created a false identity specifically to test whether I was the kind of person who could care about someone without money. That's exactly what it was like. You're right, Marcus said, because denying it would only make things worse. It started that way. But Sophie, whatever my motivations were in the beginning, they changed. You changed them. You changed everything. When? The first day. The moment you asked me what color your voice was and actually cared about the answer. The moment you understood what I meant about music creating colors and didn't treat it like a curiosity or a compensation for what I lack. You saw me, really saw me, in a way no one had before. Sophie made a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. I saw Marcus, the struggling graduate student. I have no idea who Marcus the millionaire is. He's the same person, Marcus said urgently. The money doesn't change how I hear music or the way your laugh sounds like summer rain, or how talking to you makes me feel like I'm finally awake after years of sleepwalking. It doesn't change the fact that I've fallen in love with your mind, your spirit, the way you see beauty in broken things and possibility in impossible situations. Love? Sophie's voice cracked on the word. Yes, Marcus reached across the table, his fingers finding hers with the precision born of weeks of memorizing her gestures, her habits, the geography of their shared space. I love you. Not because you passed some test or met some criteria, but because you're you. Because you make me want to be braver, more honest, more alive than I knew how to be before I met you. Sophie's fingers trembled under his, but she didn't pull away. How do I know what's real now? How do I know this isn't just another performance? Marcus lifted their joined hands and pressed her fingers to his chest, where his heart was beating so hard he was sure she could feel it through his shirt. Because I'm more terrified right now than I've ever been in my life. Because I'm sitting here with no script, no safety net, no idea how this ends. Because for the first time in my adult life, I'm risking something that actually matters. Marcus, I know I have no right to ask for forgiveness, Marcus continued, the words tumbling out like water through a broken dam. I know I broke your trust, and that trust isn't something you can just repair with explanations and apologies. But if you're willing, if there's any part of you that thinks we might be able to rebuild this on a foundation of complete honesty, then I'm here. All of me. The money. The complications. The protective father. The penthouse I never wanted. And the man who fell in love with a woman brave enough to describe colors to someone who's never seen them. Sophie was quiet for so long that Marcus began to prepare himself for rejection. He'd said everything he could think to say, exposed every vulnerable corner of his heart, and now the decision was hers. If she asked him to leave, he would. If she needed time, he'd give it to her. If she decided that trust, once broken, couldn't be repaired, he'd find a way to accept that too. The dishwasher in the back finally died completely yesterday, Sophie said suddenly. Marcus blinked, thrown by the apparent non sequitur. I'm sorry? It's been limping along for months, but yesterday it just gave up. Danny's been washing dishes by hand, and Rosie's talking about closing on weekends until we can afford a replacement. Sophie's voice was carefully casual, but Marcus could hear something underneath it, something that made his pulse quicken with hope. How much does a commercial dishwasher cost? He asked quietly. About $3,000 for a decent used one. Might as well be $3 million for what Rosie can afford right now. Marcus nodded slowly, understanding the gift she was offering him. Not forgiveness, not yet, but a chance. A way to prove that his money could be a tool for good rather than a barrier between them. What if someone wanted to donate one anonymously, as a thank you to the cafe that changed their life? Sophie's fingers tightened around his. I suppose Rosie wouldn't ask too many questions about anonymous donations. She's practical that way. And what if that same anonymous donor wanted to establish a fund for other small businesses in the neighborhood? Places that serve the community but struggle with basic equipment and repairs? That would be... Sophie paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was thick with tears. That would be the most Marcus thing I can imagine. Not throwing money at a problem, but using it to build something lasting. Marcus brought their joined hands to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. I want to use everything I have, the money, the connections, the platform, to build the kind of world you see when you look around this cafe. A world where people choose courage over comfort, where small acts of kindness create ripples of change. Together, Sophie whispered, if you'll have me. If you can forgive me for being a coward when I should have been brave. Sophie pulled her hands free, and for a moment Marcus's heart stopped. Then he felt her fingers on his face, tracing the line of his jaw with the same careful attention she brought to everything she cared about. I'm scared, she admitted. Scared of your world, scared of losing myself in something too big for me to understand. Then we'll go slowly, Marcus promised. We'll figure it out together, one day at a time, and if my world turns out to be too much, we'll build a new one. Just us, somewhere between your cafe and my penthouse, where authenticity matters more than appearances. Sophie's laugh was watery but genuine. You realize you're going to have to meet my family eventually? My grandmother is going to have opinions about you, and none of them will be polite. I can't wait, Marcus said, and meant it. Will she describe colors to me? She'll probably try to feed you until you explode and ask when you're getting married. Smart woman. Sophie's fingers stilled on his face. Marcus Chen, are you proposing to me in a closed cafe at 6 a.m? Not yet, Marcus said, catching her hand and holding it against his cheek. But ask me again in a year when you've seen me at my worst and decided I'm worth keeping anyway. Deal, Sophie whispered and leaned across the table to kiss him. The kiss tasted like coffee and forgiveness, like second chances, and the promise of mornings spent rebuilding trust one honest conversation at a time. Outside, Brooklyn was waking up, but inside Rosie's Corner Cafe, two people who'd found each other against all odds were finally ready to stop pretending to be anything other than exactly who they were. When they broke apart, Sophie rested her forehead against his, and Marcus could feel her smile in the soft warmth of her breath. So, she said, want to help me open the cafe? Fair warning, the register is cranky and the espresso machine has trust issues. Sounds perfect, Marcus said, and for the first time in his life, he meant it completely. As the sun climbed higher over Brooklyn, Painting the cafe in shades of gold and amber that Marcus could feel even if he couldn't see them, he realized that some colors were meant to be experienced with the heart rather than the eyes. And the color of this moment, this perfect, imperfect beginning, was the most beautiful thing he'd ever known. 2 hours later, the cafe buzzed with its usual morning energy. Regular customers filtered in, ordering their customary drinks and settling into familiar routines, unaware that they were witnessing the quiet revolution happening behind the counter. Marcus had shed his expensive jacket, rolling up his sleeves to help Sophie with the morning rush in whatever way he could manage. "Behind you," Sophie called out, navigating around him with practiced ease as she carried a tray of steaming mugs to a corner table. Marcus smiled at how naturally she'd adapted to having him in her workspace, never treating him like an obstacle but simply incorporating his presence into the choreography of service. Mrs. Chen, no relation, despite the shared surname, appeared at his elbow with her usual order of black coffee and a blueberry muffin. At 73, she was one of Rosie's most loyal customers and had appointed herself unofficial cafe critic. "You're new," she observed, studying Marcus with the frank curiosity of someone too old to worry about politeness. Relatively speaking, Marcus agreed, accepting the tactile familiarity of counting change, something he hadn't done since college. Sophie had insisted he learn the register, claiming everyone who worked at Rosie's needed to understand the full operation. "He's Sophie's boyfriend," called out Danny from the kitchen, his voice carrying the gleeful tone of someone sharing particularly interesting gossip. "The one she's been mysterious about for weeks." Mrs. Chen's eyebrows rose with interest. "The musician?" Quote, Marcus felt heat creep up his neck. Apparently Sophie had been talking about him to the regulars, though she'd been careful to keep his identity protected, even in casual conversation. "Among other things," Marcus said diplomatically. "Play anything I'd know?" Mrs. Chen settled onto a stool at the counter, clearly prepared for a proper interrogation. Before Marcus could answer, Sophie materialized beside him, bumping his shoulder affectionately. "Mrs. Chen, you're going to scare him away before I've properly broken him in." "Nonsense," Mrs. Chen waved dismissively. "Good men don't scare easily, and the ones that do aren't worth keeping. Besides, I want to know if he's planning to stick around or if this is one of your temporary passions." Sophie's cheeks flushed pink, but she didn't retreat from the question. Instead, she reached for Marcus's hand, her fingers threading through his with deliberate intention. "This one's different," she said simply, and Marcus felt something solid and warm settle in his chest at the certainty in her voice. The morning continued its gentle chaos around them. Marcus found himself washing mugs when the dishwasher situation became critical, his hands learning the efficient patterns Sophie demonstrated. He helped carry orders to tables, guided by Sophie's subtle directions and his own careful attention to the cafe's acoustic landscape. It wasn't until the lunch rush died down that Marcus fully appreciated what had happened. He'd spent hours in Sophie's world, contributing rather than observing, and not a single person had treated him differently because of his blindness. There had been no careful accommodations or awkward considerations, just the natural adjustments that people make when they work alongside someone they care about. "You're thinking very loudly over there," Sophie observed, appearing at his side with 2 fresh cups of coffee. "What's got your brain spinning?" Marcus accepted his coffee gratefully, still amazed by how perfectly Sophie had learned to anticipate his preferences. "I was thinking about integration," he said. "Not the kind my father tries to engineer with expensive restaurants and carefully vetted companions, but real integration. The kind where you belong somewhere because you contribute something valuable, not because someone's making space for your limitations." Sophie was quiet for a moment, considering his words. "You know what I think the difference is?" "Tell me." Quote, "Your father's approach is about making you fit into existing spaces," Sophie said thoughtfully. "But real belonging happens when you help create the space itself, when your presence changes the dynamic in ways that make everything better." Marcus turned toward her voice, struck by the insight. "Is that what happened here?" "Look around," Sophie said, and Marcus could hear the smile in her voice. Mrs. Chen hasn't stopped talking about the young man with the beautiful piano hands who actually listens when she tells stories about her late husband. Danny's been humming all morning because you appreciated his experimental sandwich combinations. And Rosie... Sophie paused, her voice growing softer. "Rosie told me this is the first time in months she's seen me look genuinely happy. The weight of belonging, real, earned belonging settled around Marcus like a perfectly fitted coat. This was what he'd been searching for without knowing how to name it. A place where his contributions mattered more than his accommodations, where his presence added value rather than requiring constant adjustment. "There's something else," Sophie said, and her voice carried a note of barely contained excitement. "I've been thinking about your idea for the neighborhood business fund. What if we made it bigger than just equipment donations?" Marcus leaned forward, intrigued by the energy in her voice. "What did you have in mind?" "A collaborative workspace," Sophie said, words tumbling out in her enthusiasm. "Small businesses helping each other instead of competing. Rosie sharing her roasting expertise with the bakery next door, the bookstore hosting coffee tastings, the art supply shop offering classes in our back room, building a community where everyone's success lifts everyone else up." The vision Sophie painted sparked something in Marcus's imagination, a way to use his resources that felt fundamentally different from the charitable donations his father's foundation typically made. This wasn't about writing checks to ease guilt or gain recognition. It was about investing in the kind of organic community that couldn't be purchased or manufactured. "You'd need someone to help coordinate all that," Marcus said carefully. "Someone who understands both business operations and community dynamics." "I was hoping you might know someone," Sophie said with barely suppressed laughter. "Someone with business experience and a talent for seeing possibilities that other people miss." Quote, Marcus felt his heart expand with something that might have been joy if he'd been brave enough to name it. "I might have some ideas about that." As the afternoon light shifted through the cafe's windows, painting everything in the warm amber that had become Marcus's favorite color, he realized that his journey had brought him exactly where he needed to be. Not to a place that accommodated his blindness, but to a place that valued his vision. Not to someone who overlooked his wealth, but to someone who saw how it could be transformed into something meaningful. And for the first time in his life, Marcus Chen felt completely, authentically, irrevocably himself. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.